Samantha.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the organizers for inviting me. Actually, this talk is two parts, so I'm giving one today and the other part not till Friday. The part on Friday is actually complicated, so if you find this part complicated, you may want to skip the other one. But I think it has a lot of meat on how we actually decide to use, what blood pressure targets we actually decide. My talk is going to be really physiological. The interesting thing about physiology, as I mentioned to one of the members here, is that it predicts nothing but explains everything after the fact. But this is a very basic measure. We use it all the time. And it's something we really need to think about what's going on with it. So I like to go back to this book by Alan C. Burton, which is old, 1965, but I love this book. I have a few copies in my office. I won't let anybody take them because I'm so afraid of losing them. And he had this wonderful introductory chapter where he talks about the celestial committee that gets together to design a human. And he says one of the things you want to look at is the priorities and problems of the system. So one of the things for the circulatory system, you need to maintain flow to organs of highest priority at all times. For the brain, this means a relatively constant flow. For the heart, this means considerable variation depending upon cardiac activity. For the pulmonary flow, this means the flow must vary with the needs of the whole body. And flow needs to increase according to the metabolic needs, and that will be a big theme in my next talk. So there's considerable local regulation which regulates which allows the adaptation of local needs. He also points out that the cardiovascular system is a pressure-regulated high arterial system in mammals and birds. So why is this so important? Well, brain and other critical blood flows can be kept constant by simply adjusting resistances. So we don't actually generate flow so much by changing pressure. Under normal physiology, we generate flows regionally by changing resistances. And again, that's my next talk on Friday. So the system works like opening taps in your home and allows, also the high pressure, of course, allows upright posture. But that's not the only reason for high pressure. Mice and rats have a pressure similar to us, and they don't have a big hydrostatic gradient. It also means that the load on the heart is kept constant. And this is very important because the heart handles pressure loads with much greater difficulty than handling stroke volume loads. So it ejects easily, but to generate a tension requires much more energy. So if the pressure is relatively constant, then this becomes easier. So here's the fundamental question. Does arterial pressure determine cardiac output, or does cardiac output determine the arterial pressure? We can look at Poiseuille's law and write it this way, that flow is equal to the arterial pressure minus the downstream pressure divided by resistance, which would argue that arterial pressure seems to be determining the flow. Or mathematically rearrange the equation this way so that arterial pressure is flow times the systemic vascular resistance and minus the downstream number, which would suggest that the cardiac output derives the arterial pressure. Well, when you ask this question, people, I think, have begun to look at the second one as the answer, but intuitively we tend to act a lot as the first one is the answer, that the pressure is driving the flow. I heard this one of the talks this morning, we may hear it again from the same speaker, this line that we need that pressure to drive the flow. You do to get the regional flows, but not the total cardiac output. So, blood pressure does not indicate the total flow or even regional flows. Consider the septic patient. Low blood pressure, high cardiac output. Maximal aerobic exercise, very high cardiac output, 5 times normal, 20–30% change in systolic pressure, and minimal change in mean pressure. Patient with cardiogenic shock. You can actually find these patients sometimes having pressures that are above normal, and yet you have a cardiac index of 1.1, 1.2. So the key point is this way. Blood pressure is determined by the total cardiac output, which is related to what's coming back to the heart, and the peripheral resistance. And here the measured variables is the blood pressure. That's where you get called because their patients have normal. And the cardiac output is either measured or somehow thought about. And the SVR, the resistance, is a calculated numbers. So the first question I always ask at the bedside when the pressure is down, is the cardiac output decreased? In which case, that's the problem, and think of why it's down. Or is the cardiac output normal or elevated, in which the primary problem for the blood pressure is the decrease in resistance. Yes, a higher cardiac output would help, but that's not the primary problem. So why do we care about arterial pressure? So as I said, it determines the regional flows, but not the total cardiac output. So our system works much like a water distribution to a community. We have water towers that provide a constant pressure head, and you open a tap in your bathtub or your sink or flush a toilet, which allows that pressure head to drain. And our vasculature system works pretty well that way. We create a pressure head in the aorta, and you open it up in the regions to distribute the flow. Much more on that in the next talk. Now, 3 types of energy determine the pressure. There's elastic, kinetic, and gravitational or potential energy. The one we deal with the most is elastic energy. So pressure is a force per cross-sectional area. The P here refers to the elastic pressure. This pressure is distending the vessels. It's the major vascular energy, as I said, arterial pressure, venous pressure, ventricular systolic pressure, capillary pressures. These are all primarily elastic pressures. They provide a kind of potential energy due to the fluid they contain. And think of it as a force distending a balloon, as shown here. So if I had a balloon with a drain and I fill it up to some value, the stretch that I created in the wall will create the emptying of that balloon. And this, I'll talk tomorrow on Guyton's view of the circulation and go into this concept in more detail on venous return. So the volume and stretchiness determine the pressure in that container. Now, pressures are measured relative to the atmosphere, which we call 0. This is also not really true. So when we say the arterial pressure is 120/80, that's relative to the surroundings. The real pressure, if you measure it, you have to take into account, if you're looking at the forces on the inside and outside of the wall, in this case would be 880/840 millimeters of mercury. And if you're doing the stress analysis on the wall, these are the numbers you really have to use, and you actually get a completely opposite calculation on the stress if you use the simple one. Now the kinetic energy is related to 1/2 the mass times velocity squared. If I normalize by volume, then it's density times velocity squared. It's small on the arterial side. It only accounts for about 3 millimeters of mercury in the systolic pressure. But on the venous side, the same velocity is occurring, and so it actually has a greater contribution on venous pressures and also pulmonary pressures. Now, what about gravity, rho GH? So this is the gravitational force. The weight is the force produced by the acceleration of gravity on your body mass. So a column of fluid has a weight based on its height, and that determines the mass, and therefore the acceleration due to gravity. And work can be done because of different levels. Think of flow going down a river from a high area to an area that's lower. So this has important implications for us, bipeds. So the pressure measured with a fluid-filled system, first of all, which is basically all our catheters, are relative to an arbitrary reference point that you pick. So where you pick your measuring device becomes extremely important on the number that you get. And this is because the fluid in the catheter has a weight and therefore a force. Now when you're in this supine position, let's say your arterial pressure was 100 and your venous pressure at the level of the heart was 2. You have about a 5 millimeter pressure drop from the large arteries down to the smaller arteries before you get into the arterioles and the major drop in pressure. And the venous pressure is there's a 5 millimeter to 2 millimeter drop from the periphery back to the heart. Now we stand up. So let's keep the same arterial pressure of 100 millimeters of mercury relative to the heart. So we put our reference level at the heart level. And the venous pressure is still 2 relative to that level. But if I now put a catheter all the way down to your foot and measure the pressure, when it's 95 up at the level of based on the level that you had for the normal drop from the heart to the periphery, the true pressure is actually, you have to put in the height, which is this person, let's say the equivalent of 88 millimeters of mercury based on the height and the density, which means the real pressure there is 183 millimeters in your foot when you're standing. On the venous side, you have to do the same calculations, and in which case the venous pressure is 93. What that means is when you're standing, the arterial pressure in your foot is about the equivalent of what your arterial pressure is in your aorta when you are lying down. It's a big pressure. No wonder when you take a transatlantic flight, you take your shoes off, your feet are swollen at the end of it. Now in the head, it gets even trickier. So now we have about equivalent to 44 millimeters going up. So the arterial pressure at the head now, at the top standing up, is only going to be 51 millimeters of mercury, given these numbers. And importantly, the venous pressures are actually going to be negative, minus 40, 39. What this means is, in an upright person, as I said, the venous pressures in their foot is almost the equivalent of your normal arterial pressure. And the negative pressure in the head created by this creates a waterfall, which actually has a very important function. It limits the quick drainage out of your head. So if you didn't have this, when you stood up, you'd be sucking all the volume out of your head. But that doesn't happen because you get a waterfall effect, which then limits the flow. Okay, now the flow still occurs with that pressure of 183 because what counts is the beginning and the end. And the beginning was 100 and the end was 2, so you still have flow. Now, fluid always flows from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. No, as I've shown you. The true driving pressure is dependent upon all the energy in the system, the elastic, the gravitational, and the kinetic. So if you're looking at flow through a system that goes from a tube that has an area that narrows in the middle, what happens when it narrows, the flow has to be the same all the way through. So the velocity has to increase in that narrow part. So the kinetic energy increases in that narrow part. And you can see it goes in the bottom there from 3.8, so from 100 to 200 centimeters per second. Now if you have a catheter facing the stream, what will happen is, like P3, you'll notice there, the pressure hardly changes. But if you have a lateral catheter, where the opening's on the side, then you'll see a considerable drop because a lot of the elastic pressure was converted into kinetic energy to keep a conservation of energy constant. And then when you go back to being wide again, then you again see that the elastic energy, P6, actually comes back up again. So in between, it looks like you went from an area of low pressure to high pressure. But it's the total energy that counts. So there it looks like it fell, and it looks like it rose, and it does, but it's only one part of the total energy equation. This is a factor that's very important in expanding aneurysms. Okay. So arterial lines that we use face the line, so they face the flow, so they take into account kinetic energy as well as elastic energy. The cuff pressure that we use is really only measuring the lateral pressure. The significance of kinetic energy, well, flow is velocity times cross-sectional area, so the kinetic energy is the same in the aorta and the vena cava, and as I said, therefore it's a greater contribution to the pressures in the vena cava because the overall pressure is lower. And in a septic patient, this may be a fairly big point. I don't really know of any good data looking at this. But your cardiac output, if your cardiac output is double, the velocity's got to be higher. And how much does that contribute to the actual driving force for flow? I actually know of no measurements. Peter, there's a project for you to look at. Okay, now if we're looking at changes in flow, let's say I start off with a system where the resistances are equal on both sides. An important point is there's two ways, and more, but basically two ways that you can change the distribution of flow. You can constrict one side, and that'll drive more to the other, or you can dilate the same side. So, for example, in exercise, the major mechanism is actually dilatation. When we're giving vasoconstrictors, we're hoping we're constricting the sides that we don't want, and not constricting the areas that we want, such as the heart and brain, but we don't know that, but that's our assumption. Now, just a few more points. So one is the calculation of systemic vascular resistance. We typically calculate this going from the mean arterial pressure down to the right atrial pressure, and the slope of this line is 1 over the resistance. However, things are always a little more complicated. If you actually do the pressure flow study in a whole animal or even in a limb, and you control the flow and the pressure, and you rapidly turn down the flow, what you find is you get a zero flow pressure, the outflow pressure, which is actually higher than the right atrial pressure. Why is this occurring? So this is the concept of a vascular waterfall that you may know on the venous return side and zone 2 in the lungs, but it also occurs at the arteriolar level at the 100 micron or so vessels. So remember, the amount of water going over a waterfall is not affected by the height of the fall. So once you have a critical closing pressure, downstream pressures no longer have an effect. And what this means is, as you progressively, on the left, as you progressively lower the flow, you'll see that the calculated slope of resistance, going from the actual pressure you have to the right atrial pressure, the slope of that line gradually decreases. In other words, it looks like the resistance is going up as the pressure goes down. So on the right side, I've plotted resistance. I don't know if I can get this to work. No, I can't. Oops, wrong one. I'll go back. Shouldn't have done that. How do I go back? Yeah, there we go. Okay. Oh, it does work. Okay. So here the slopes are going down, and here, as or looking at the other way, as I decrease pressure, the resistance goes up. As I increase pressure or flow, the calculated resistance goes up. Now that might make sense. You would think that the baroreceptors are just doing their thing, so it makes sense. But the calculation will look like that way whether or not there is a reflex. So that's very important for venodilators like Villanone. It's often been argued, oh, they just work by decreasing afterload. You can't tell unless you have 2 points on a pressure flow line. This was a study I did years ago in an isolated dog hindland. We transiently did we isolated the flow and turned it to zero so we could calculate these pressure flow lines, reperfused, and then got, in the second part, then we get it after the reactive hyperemia. And you get this kind of slope where the zero flow is at 75 millimeters of mercury. Now there's a slight artifact in that because there's probably some continuing flow that we worked on in the paper, so it's a little bit lower, but it's still in the 60s in a resting dog hindland. And with the reactive hyperemia, the resistance goes down as expected, but also this critical closing pressure. So this becomes another variable regulating the flow. And in fact, Starling, in his original studies, the Starling resistor, he put it into his system so he could have a relatively constant back pressure in the system. So looking at the overall data and exercise, a shift in both the slope and the intercept contribute to the marked increase in blood flow to these regions. Okay, and the last thing is, what's really important is this distribution of resistances. I'm not going to talk about these today. This is my talk next day, but I've told you that the pressure is relatively regulated. We generate distribution of flow by changing the slopes of each of these organs. The crucial point here is you notice how different they are. These are based on total flow, not per weight, with the splanchnic being the highest, the kidney very high, the heart actually lower because it's only a smaller percentage of total blood flow. And next day I'll show what happens as the things adapt. So the last things, I guess, is what pressure should we use? Well, the first, I think I heard it this morning, and I certainly agree, observe the patient. Are they fully awake, communicating, good color, urinating? I don't care what the pressure is if you have that. It's what I sometimes call the phone sign. This is when I was called to see a patient who was a febrile neutropenic and her pressure was low, and I got to the room and she said, could you just wait a minute? I'm just talking to my family. I thought, you know what? I don't think I need to see you. For the sake of time, I don't think I'm going to go into the details on these. I have to confess, I tend to use the systolic pressure the most because that's what you get called about on the wards. The problem is it's a little less reliable because of frequency issues, so I want to know that I have a good response. Mean pressure, I think, is still probably the most popular, but the problem is if you have some of these patients with a really low diastolic pressure, it really colors the issue and I think causes excess use of catecholamines, but that's a bias, no data. And I don't get as uptight about the diastolic pressure unless there is a coronary lesion, and I'll refer to that in my next talk. So in summary, we're a pressure-regulated species. Arterial pressure is relatively constant under normal conditions. Volume and compliance determine the pressures in each region. Cardiac output and SVR determine the central pressure, and central pressure determines the regional pressures. Total energy, not pressure, determines flow, and it's a sum of an elastic, gravitational, and kinetic components. And arterial closing pressures, and not right atrial pressure, are the true outflow pressures of the circulation. So calculated resistance will seem to decrease anytime you raise flow or raise pressure. This point about the critical closing pressure, Dr. Bellomo, earlier session this afternoon, talked about the potential back pressure of the right atrium to the kidney. That may not be true if there is a critical closing pressure there, although I must say the kidney is one region where I suspect it won't be, but it actually has never been measured as far as I know. Thank you.